Welcome back. This year's Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey includes questions about what employees think about the government's virus response and remote work. That information should impact budget cycles and strategies of all kinds this year and beyond. Mark Forman's Vice President of Digital Government Strategy for SAIC. He's former eGov administrator at the Office of Management and Budget. Mark, thanks very much for joining me. You have this unique balance of understanding budget cycles and information technology. What should leaders be thinking about as they're planning not just 22, because that's the budget cycle the agencies are in now, but 23 and beyond?
Well, I think based on the work that we've been doing and the results from our survey of government-wide executives, it's pretty clear that there's a shift underway from what we used to call telework, and I think in the future we're going to look at that as the natural work environment or remote work at a minimum. Just a little bit of data. Before the pandemic, people were basically teleworking less than 2 days a week. After that pandemic, or even right now, we see agencies like the health agencies working more than 5 days a week, and they're doing it virtually. And when we ask them about what would happen post-pandemic, it's pretty much more than 3.5 or 4 days a week at least that people will be working remote. So I think you have to think about as a CIO or a federal executive, how does this change the way that you do your work, the way you collaborate, your access to data in your systems? And that involves not just the technology and the security, but your business processes as well.
The second question, it strikes me, to come behind those that you just posed as the first ones is, how do you make the investments that you need to make in order to support that? What do you, once you know what you have and you know what you need to get to where you want to be, figuring out the investment seems to be the second piece. Is that a fair read?
I think so, and I think in general, there are 3 phases that we've talked about this before that most agencies go through in an event like what we've had with the pandemic. And the first is just the triage. So there were a lot of near-term solutions to give people access to equipment and to bandwidth. I think that's going to now go through another phase, and I believe a lot of agencies are already in that, where they're improving the quality of their security, their access to data and systems. And the third phase, we'll see some restructuring. And this really is where the business case comes in on re-engineering and reinventing the way people do their work and collaborate. And it may be that you're also looking at physical investments as part of that. And I think you've had both the chief management officer and the head of GSA talking a bit about what they're looking at the future of the workspace. So it's going to be a pretty comprehensive look at physical and virtual ways people will have to do their work and want to do their work in the future.
Are there things that may not seem obvious on first inventory, the kind of inventory you're describing, that agencies should make sure that they double check and triple check for as they're building these strategies, Mark?
Well, I think another fascinating insight from the survey that we did is the focus on, number one, keeping their workforce safe. And that's kind of a mixed use of the physical facilities, and when people come in, some agencies, they have to come in to do the work in defense and intelligence agencies. And so I think that's going to be a unique area of investment, is how do you create a safe workforce while we're still dealing with the pandemic and that mix of physical and virtual environments. The second thing that I found very enlightening in the survey that we did was the concern about effective use of taxpayers' resources and prevention of fraud, waste, and abuse. You know, in the past, we relied on physically seeing somebody or talking to somebody, seeing a physical piece of paper. And with the movement to online transactions, that changes a lot of the core business processes. We have to get out of the physical world, and that's going to have different implications if you're a regulatory agency versus a benefits or grants making agency. So that's a second big area that I think we're going to see a lot of inventing and leveraging of new approaches.
I appreciate your use of the term remote work at the beginning of our conversation, or thinking about this as a natural work environment. I'm reminded of a term from way back in my old radio days called name it and claim it. Whatever you call something is what that something becomes. And it strikes me that that nomenclature is important, isn't it, Mark?
It sure is, because I think there was a notion, at least in most of the telework initiatives for a couple decades in the federal government, that that was a nice to have. And now it's core. It's no longer telework was you could do 1 day a week and avoid the traffic. It's now people are going to work remotely most of the time.
We have about 30 seconds left, Mark. What would you like to see from your former agency at OMB? What would you like to see them do to facilitate the things that we've talked about in this conversation?
Well, I think a focus on how now do they do that business case? How do they link up things like the IDEA Act initiative, which requires a better user experience, with evidence-based policy making investments in this context of us moving away from a physical document-based world?
Mark Forman, thanks very much as always. Great to talk to you.
Thank you, Francis.